When a self-proclaimed HOA president invades your peaceful mountain cabin with clipboards and fake fines, you might laugh it off until your retired lawyer wife turns the tables and unleashes a legal storm that exposes the ultimate neighborhood scam. I was 3 bites into my cinnamon toast and halfway through a peaceful mountain morning when a woman in a neon visor kicked open our garden gate, marched up the slope in orthopedic sandals and yelled that she was here for an emergency HOA inspection. That might have made sense if we had an HOA, but we didn't. Never had. Which is exactly what made the scene so surreal, especially with her waving a clipboard like it was a holy decree and demanding to inspect our gutters, our septic tank, and as she so politely put it, the general aura of regulatory compliance surrounding our porch furniture. I stared at her in dumb silence while my wife Laura blinked once, calmly set her mug down, and asked, "Are you lost?" The woman who introduced herself as Karen snorted and said she was the president of the local homeowners association. Laura and I exchanged a glance. Our cabin sat at the end of a private road surrounded by 70 acres of trees and no neighbors in visible range, and we'd bought it in part to avoid the precise madness that had now arrived in Crocs and a power complex. I couldn't help but ask her where exactly this HOA came from. She rattled off a subdivision name that didn't exist, gestured vaguely downhill, and declared that even off-grid communities need leadership. Laura didn't flinch. She stood up, brushed imaginary lint from her shirt, and told Karen she had 5 seconds to get off our property or we'd call the sheriff. Karen scoffed, snapped a picture of our birdhouse with her phone, and warned us that we were non-compliant and belligerent, before disappearing back down the hill like a gossip tornado heading for its next crisis. I figured that was the end of it. A bizarre encounter, sure, but harmless. Lara said nothing as she stepped back inside, but her expression had changed from amusement to calculation. I followed her and found her already unlocking a heavy steel drawer beneath our bookshelf. It was the one I hadn't seen opened in years, the one that held her old law files. She flipped through thick folders with practiced hands, pulled out a binder with dusty tabs marked by county codes and litigation notes, and calmly said she just claimed jurisdiction over the wrong cabin. I'll admit, I hadn't thought about Lara's old career in a long time. After retiring from years in federal litigation, she'd thrown herself into gardening, sourdough baking, and hiking trails with our golden retriever like she'd never once cross-examined a Fortune 500 CEO into tears. But watching her work now, I realized her mind still moved with the same sharp, unrelenting focus that used to terrify opposing counsel. She sat down with her laptop and began drafting something, silent, efficient, like she was pulling a blueprint out of thin air. I asked if she was writing a complaint letter. She said without looking up, "No, a subpoena." I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. By sunset, she had printed a 4-page legal document with citations formatted in language so precise it could make a judge's gavel blush. Meanwhile, I searched online and found nothing. No registered HOA within 30 miles. No local ordinance board, nothing even resembling a legitimate entity tied to Karen's so-called authority. It was like she had invented a governing body just to satisfy a bureaucratic craving. We both knew people like that existed, but we never thought one would crawl out of the trees to inspect our porch chairs. The next day, a note appeared on our door. Laminated and zip-tied to our handle. It was an official-looking violation notice claiming we had failed to maintain uniform aesthetics and failed to file a hammock permit. Lara scanned it and said, "This is printed on cardstock from Hobby Lobby." She's getting bold. We checked our cameras. Karen had returned in the night. That night, Lara made a few phone calls. The next morning, I woke up to find her on the phone with a county records clerk verifying parcel numbers and confirming something important. She's been sending these notices to others, too. Lara said, people near the Lake Road. Some of them paid her. That's when it shifted from annoying to criminal. We weren't just dealing with an overzealous neighbor. We were dealing with someone impersonating a legal authority to extract money from vulnerable homeowners. Lara's expression settled into something cold and determined. The day after that, Karen came back, this time with 2 more women, one in tennis gear and the other carrying a clipboard that looked suspiciously like a menu from Applebee's with stickers over it. Together, they introduced themselves as the newly formed Mountain Ridge Compliance Board. They tried to take photos of our garage, our firewood stack, and even our dog's water bowl. Lara walked out without a word, and handed Karen the subpoena she'd printed. Karen looked down, laughed, then paused. "What is this?" she asked. "You're being sued," Lara said. Karen read the header, her cheeks flushed, and she crumpled the papers in her hand and threw them at our feet like she was casting out a demon. Lara picked them up, dusted them off, and said, "Now it's 2 lawsuits." Karen backed away slowly, muttering something about talking to her attorney. Lara replied without missing a beat. "Good. Have them call me. I'm listed as counsel on page 3. The other women scattered like pigeons at a firecracker. I could barely believe what I was seeing, but deep down I also felt that familiar thrill that always came when Lara stepped fully into her old self, the side of her I hadn't seen since before retirement. The lawyer who once took down an illegal land-grabbing scheme in Wyoming and got 3 crooked real estate agents disbarred before lunch. She was back that evening. We sat on the porch, the sun melting across the treetops, and Lara reviewed her case folder while sipping from a chipped mug that read in faded letters, "I object." She wasn't doing this for fun, she said. She was doing this because fraud like this often slips through the cracks, especially in remote places where retirees just want peace and quiet. She wasn't about to let someone like Karen weaponize legal-looking forms and clipboards to bully people out of money or pee. She thinks the woods are quiet. Lara said she doesn't know how loud justice can get. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing with certainty. Karen hadn't just picked a random cabin to harass. She'd picked the one cabin that belonged to a woman who once sued a fake nonprofit so hard it lost its .org status. I could see it already. Subpoenas flying. County records unsealed. Secrets dragged into daylight. The mountain was about to get loud. 2 mornings after the subpoena had been handed to Karen like a hot plate she didn't ask for, we woke up to the sound of tires crunching gravel and a voice shouting, "Inspection in progress." Lara barely looked up from her toast, but I stood and peeked through the blinds to see not just Karen, but 2 new clipboard-wielding sidekicks flanking her like she was some backwoods general. They wore matching shirts that read Mountain Ridge Compliance Task Force, though the logos were clearly ironed on and slightly crooked. One of them held what appeared to be a measuring tape, and the other was scanning our deck with a dollar store laser pointer attached to her phone. Karen stepped onto our porch without permission and barked out, "We're conducting follow-up measurements and secondary visual assessments." Lara rose slowly, walked to the door, and opened it with the calm of someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment. She didn't speak at first. She just held up her phone and pressed a button. The security camera footage from 2 days ago played in her hand, showing Karen trespassing and defacing our door with a laminated violation notice. Then she reached behind the door, pulled out a fresh manila envelope, and handed it directly to Karen. "Consider yourself served." Again, Lara said, her voice flat and surgical. Karen stared at it, eyes narrowing like she was staring down an enemy who didn't know the rules of war. But Lara knew them. She'd helped write some of them. Karen turned red, sputtered, and threw the envelope to the ground again, declaring it invalid. Lara, without missing a beat, took out another envelope and handed it to the woman with the measuring tape. "You too," she said. The woman looked horrified like she'd been caught trying to counterfeit monopoly money at the Federal Reserve. Karen screamed, "This is harassment!" and began filming us with her phone. Lara just smiled and waved. "Smile for discovery," she said softly, then turned back inside. By mid-afternoon, we started noticing subtle signs that Karen was escalating. Flyers appeared on local bulletin boards, community centers, the bait shop, even the back of a gas pump, announcing that Mountain Ridge HOA was hosting a town hall meeting regarding non-compliant properties and discussing fines, ordinances, and enforcement actions. It was written in legal-sounding jargon, but the formatting was a mess, full of typos and grammatical chaos. Still, it worked on some people. A few neighbors asked us if there had really been a change in zoning law. One even asked if we were going to contest our hammock fine or just pay it. Lara shook her head and said she's running a con and it's bigger than just us. That night, she got on a Zoom call with a friend in the county recorder's office and started piecing things together. It turned out Karen had filed a fake HOA incorporation document under a slightly misspelled version of the area's old subdivision name. Something like Mountain Ridge Preserve Estates, but with preserve spelled wrong. It wasn't a real registration. It wasn't legal. But to someone who didn't know better, it looked official enough to be dangerous. Worse, Karen had opened a P.O. box and a Venmo account under the HOA's name and had already collected almost $3,000 in dues from retirees, widows, and vacation property owners who just didn't want trouble. Lara's jaw set in that quiet way I recognized from years ago, back when she used to prep for cross-examination like a chess player hunting checkmate in 5 moves. She called the local sheriff's office, then started drafting formal fraud complaint. By midnight, she had paperwork ready for the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Unit. I offered to make tea. She asked for coffee. The gloves were off. The next morning, a bright pink sign was zip-tied to our mailbox. It read urgent final notice and demanded immediate payment of delinquent HOA dues in the amount of $400. It was signed by Karen herself in pen with a little stamp of a cartoon squirrel for reasons I'll never understand. Lara took it down, scanned it, and added it to her file. Then she called a process server she knew from her trial days and gave him Karen's full name, phone number, and plate number. I'd barely taken my first sip of coffee when the man pulled into our driveway, asked if the clipboard woman was the same Karen from the scam HOA, and laughed out loud when Lara handed him 5 subpoenas. "That's more action than I've seen in months," he said, shaking his head. "Let's go fishing." Meanwhile, I decided to check the wildlife cams I'd set up along the trail near the tree line. I hadn't expected much, but what I saw made me pause. Karen had returned again in the night, this time wearing a headlamp and attempting to hammer a plastic A-frame sign into the soil by our driveway. She gave up after 3 swings, then kicked the sign into the bushes and stormed off, muttering to herself. When I showed the footage to Lara, she said only one word: evidence. Over the next 3 days, the heat intensified. Karen sent letters to the county complaining about zoning violations, barking dogs, unsanctioned exterior lighting, and what she called suspicious gravel redistribution. Each complaint was more absurd than the last. Lara responded with formal legal statements and attached the subpoena dates to every reply. The county, to its credit, had already opened an investigation. Turns out Karen had not only falsified HOA documents, but also used a stolen business license number from a long-defunct landscaping company. The sheriff paid her a visit, not to arrest her yet, but to inform her that impersonating a legal entity carried serious consequences. Karen responded by putting up a new sign in her yard that read, "This community is under new management," and planting tiny flags around her perimeter like she was claiming land for an empire. Meanwhile, neighbors began knocking on our door. Some angry, some confused, all looking for clarity. Lara invited them to sit on the porch and began calmly walking them through what was happening. She showed them the forged documents, the fake filings, the fraud complaints, and even a hand-drawn HOA map Karen had distributed that included properties that hadn't existed in 20 years. The older couple from 2 lots over, the ones who had paid her twice in gift cards, nearly cried when Lara told them they'd be part of a class action suit to recover their money. Word began to spread. Karen's circle of influence was shrinking by the hour, but she didn't back down. That afternoon, she marched up the road with a megaphone and shouted legal jargon into the trees. "This is a binding residential compact under Article 6 of the Neighborhood Enforcement Clause," she bellowed. Lara walked out onto the deck, lifted her phone, and live-streamed her. Within minutes, friends and strangers alike were watching and commenting. Some laughing, others stunned, most tagging news outlets and county officials. Karen saw the camera, froze, and then screamed, "This is all being twisted. I am the law here," before storming off with her megaphone in hand like a disgraced dictator walking off her own press conference. Later that evening, Lara sat quietly in the study, assembling case files, sorting timelines, and drafting affidavits. I brought her a glass of wine and sat beside her while she typed. The wind had just begun to carry the scent of pine sap and distant rain when the first real crack in Karen's fantasy empire showed itself, not with a bang, but a whisper from a frightened old man with a trembling hand and a manila envelope soaked in nervous sweat. He showed up at our door just after sunrise, shuffling through the gravel, with eyes darting toward the trees, as if Karen herself might be perched in one of them, clipboard in hand, ready to swoop down and find him for treason. His name was Richard. He lived half a mile downhill in a crooked little cottage with a tin roof and a garden full of wind chimes, and he'd brought with him what he called proof of madness. Lara led him to a rocking chair, poured him tea, and listened without interrupting as he unfolded his tale. 2 months ago, Karen had introduced herself to him and several other elderly residents as the new director of the Mountain Ridge Residential Oversight Initiative, claiming the county had appointed her during a zoning realignment. She used long words, waved around a stack of what turned out to be recycled legal paperwork from an old condo association in Arizona, and promised to protect property values from what she called rogue architecture and non-standard landscaping. Richard, like many of the older neighbors, hadn't questioned it. He paid her $300 in cash and even attended a compliance training session she held in her backyard where she'd presented a slideshow on maintaining visual harmony in mailbox design. Richard now realized he'd been conned. Worse, he had receipts, photos, and a document she made him sign agreeing to her fake bylaws. Lara took the envelope, thanked him gently, and added his testimony to the rapidly growing mountain of evidence sitting on her desk. Later that same day, we received a voicemail from Karen's former clipboard sidekick. A woman named Trish, who had apparently joined Karen's crusade under the impression it was a real community initiative. Her voice shook as she confessed in a 3-minute monologue that Karen had instructed them to carry out mock inspections, send violation notices to anyone with a shed or bird feeder, and collect cash in untraceable envelopes to speed up neighborhood beautification efforts. Trish said she didn't want to go to jail and was willing to testify. Lara saved the voicemail, flagged it in 3 folders, and quietly said, "It's collapsing." The momentum shifted like a boulder rolling downhill. Calls came in from other neighbors who had once laughed off Karen's antics, but now wanted to know if they'd unknowingly been scammed. One woman near the lake sent us a photo of a handwritten invoice. Karen had mailed her demanding a $12 fine for painting her mailbox an unregistered hue. Another man reported that Karen had posted a laminated violation. Improper grill usage sign on his deck after a barbecue. The stories grew more absurd by the hour, and Lara documented every single one. But what tied it all together wasn't just the ridiculousness of the fines or the theatrical language Karen used. It was the discovery that none of it had any legal standing at all. There was no HOA, not even a defunct one. Karen had manufactured the entire structure from thin air, complete with bylaws, enforcement schedules, dues, collection slips, and fake letterhead. And somehow, through charm, intimidation, or sheer audacity, she'd made people believe it. Lara and I drove down to the county clerk's office with a box full of documentation, ready to confirm once and for all what we already suspected. The clerk, a wiry man with thick glasses and a love for post-it notes, searched every relevant registry while chewing gum with mechanical intensity. After 20 minutes, he looked up and said, "There is no Mountain Ridge HOA, nothing current, nothing archived, nothing pending." Then he added with a hint of confusion, "But there is a recent filing. Mountain Ridge Preserve Estates Neighborhood Oversight Collective LLC filed 2 months ago. Registered by Karen J. Teller." Lara blinked once. That was it. Karen had skipped every legal step of forming an HOA and instead registered a limited liability company with a name that sounded official, then used it to impersonate a homeowners association. That meant she wasn't just a nuisance. She was a fraudster hiding behind corporate paperwork and hoping no one would look too closely. On the way back up the mountain, Lara made 3 calls to the state's Consumer Protection Bureau, the county sheriff's Economic Crimes Division, and a local news reporter who'd left a business card in our mailbox the week before. Each one of them responded the same way, with cautious curiosity turning quickly into disbelief and then into urgency. This wasn't just a quirky neighbor gone rogue. This was someone impersonating a governing body, falsifying documents, and defrauding multiple residents, many of them elderly. The case had grown beyond cabin property lines and HOA signs. It was now a matter of criminal inquiry. Back at home, Lara printed out the LLC registration and laid it beside a dozen forged HOA notices we'd collected. The address on the registration was Karen's, but she'd listed a suite number, Suite 203, that didn't exist. A quick Google search revealed that Suite 203 was the mailbox number at a shipping store in town. Karen had turned a UPS drop box into the headquarters of her fake empire. Lara called the shipping center and confirmed it. The man on the phone chuckled and said, "Yeah, she comes in wearing a little badge and signs everything with a gold pen." That night, Lara held a quiet meeting on our deck, inviting only the residents who had reached out with concerns. There were 12 of them huddled in fleece jackets and gripping mugs of cider. As Lara walked them through the scam's architecture with the precision of a seasoned prosecutor, she explained what an HOA legally required to operate, what an LLC could and couldn't do, and how Karen had used the illusion of authority to control and exploit. Some people were shocked, others were furious, a few laughed bitterly, embarrassed they'd ever believed her. But by the end of the meeting, every one of them had agreed to be part of the lawsuit. Lara distributed simple affidavits and explained how class action filings worked. The quiet resolve in the air was undeniable. People had been fooled, but they weren't going to stay fooled. Karen had underestimated something more powerful than law degrees or courtroom swagger. She'd underestimated the will of a small community that had found its voice. The next morning, I stepped outside to get the paper and noticed something odd. The faux HOA signs that Karen had planted around the trail were gone. All of them. Every zip-tied laminated warning and crooked wooden stake had vanished overnight. Either she'd sensed the pressure or someone else had taken matters into their own hands. But the air felt different, lighter, like the mountain itself had taken a deep breath. I brought the paper in and found Lara reviewing a witness statement submitted by Trish. Now fully cooperating. She'd listed every fake inspection she'd conducted under Karen's orders, including the infamous infrared mulch check on a retired dentist's front yard. Lara chuckled once, then returned to full focus. I asked her how far this would go. She said, far enough to make sure no one ever tries this again. That afternoon, we received a certified letter addressed to Lara. Inside was a cease and desist notice from Karen's. It began with a courtroom so quiet you could hear the bailiff blink and ended with Karen nearly slipping on a folder of her own fake bylaws as she stormed out of the building in humiliation. The morning of the preliminary hearing was wrapped in fog and nerves. But Lara was calm, almost serene, as if her bones had memorized the rhythm of legal warfare long ago and now moved on muscle memory. She wore the same charcoal gray suit she hadn't touched since retiring, brushed off and ironed into submission, her hair pulled back with precision, her eyes full of controlled fire. I watched from the gallery, fingers gripping the bench as Karen strutted into the courtroom like she was attending a parade thrown in her honor. She wore a cream-colored pantsuit 3 sizes too tight, sunglasses indoors, and carried a gold clipboard as if it were a holy artifact. Behind her trailed a man in khakis, who introduced himself to the court as her legal representative, but quickly revealed himself to be her nephew Todd, a second-year law student who had apparently agreed to help Aunt Karen set the record straight. The judge, an older man with a skeptical brow and a disdain for theatrics, looked over his glasses and asked for the real attorney of record. Lara stood, introduced herself with quiet authority, and presented a thick binder labeled State of Redacted Vari. The room shifted. Karen visibly deflated, her sunglasses sliding slightly down her nose as she hissed something at Todd, who responded by flipping frantically through a dog-eared copy of Civil Procedure for Beginners. The judge called for opening statements. Todd, bless his heart, launched into a scattered monologue about community integrity, moral oversight, and the need for order in rural chaos. He cited Wikipedia, mispronounced jurisprudence, and argued that Karen had done nothing wrong because nobody else was organizing the neighborhood, and sometimes a leader has to rise where there is none. When Lara rose, her tone sliced the air like a scalpel. No histrionics, just facts. She listed victims by name, outlined the forged LLC documentation, displayed laminated violation notices Karen had physically delivered to mailboxes, and played video footage of Karen declaring herself president of Mountain Ridge while hammering signs into the earth like some post-apocalyptic land baron. The judge raised a hand to pause her mid-sentence, not out of annoyance, but because he needed clarification on whether or not Karen had actually written fines in colored glitter pen. Lara confirmed that yes, she had, and the court erupted in murmurs. Todd objected. Overruled. Karen whispered furiously into his ear, clearly not understanding that this wasn't Facebook, where she could delete negative comments and block accountability. When Lara displayed the Venmo record showing thousands in dues paid to Karen's HOA enforcement account, the judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Then he asked the clerk to mark the evidence for review. Karen, sensing momentum slipping, stood and shouted that this was a kangaroo court and that the real crime was people disrespecting community values. The judge calmly asked her to sit down or be removed for contempt. She sat, but not before mumbling something about how the squirrels respected her authority more than her neighbors did. During the witness portion, Richard took the stand. His voice trembled at first, but with Lara's careful questioning, he found his footing. He described how Karen came to his door with a homemade badge, threatened him with property seizure for non-compliance, and convinced him to pay her cash in a brown envelope labeled Voluntary Community Enhancement Fund. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as Richard, in his plaid flannel and Velcro shoes, pulled out a crumpled violation slip and handed it to the clerk. It accused him of harboring unauthorized wind chimes. Lara thanked him, then played Tricia's voicemail aloud for the courtroom to hear. Karen's former enforcer described how they'd fake inspections, write up violations from memory, and once tried to fine a guy for having a hammock that interrupted the mountain's natural skyline. When Lara finished, she said, "Your Honor, the evidence is not only clear, it's comical in how blatantly fraudulent it is." Todd rose for cross-examination, but the judge waved him off. "I've heard enough," he said. Then he turned to Karen and asked if she had anything to say in her defense before ruling on whether the case would proceed to full trial. Karen stood, tugged at her collar, and tried to conjure the same theatrical defiance she'd used on our trail. "I only did what nobody else had the courage to do," she began. This community was falling apart. There was trash on porches. Hammocks were hung without symmetry. Mailboxes didn't match. I brought order. The judge waited unmoved. Karen continued, "They all knew I was trying to help. This isn't fraud. It's civic duty." Then she pointed directly at Lara. "She just wants to destroy me because I called her out for hoarding patio furniture." That drew a few stifled laughs from the audience. The judge cleared his throat and delivered his decision. The case, he ruled, would proceed to full civil trial on grounds of fraudulent representation, unlawful financial gain, and impersonation of a governing body. He also granted Lara's request for an injunction against Karen to prevent her from distributing further notices, collecting dues, or performing any activities under the false HOA's name. Karen let out a noise that was somewhere between a scream and a growl and attempted to storm out of the courtroom, but fate, poetic and cruel, tripped her up. Her heel caught the corner of her gold clipboard, which had somehow fallen to the floor, and she slipped, sprawling across the linoleum in an awkward tangle of limbs, documents, and pride. Lara, ever the professional, didn't smirk, but I did, just a little. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. The live stream from Lara's phone the week before had gone semi-viral in local circles, and now the press wanted answers. Karen refused to speak. She covered her face with a printout of her fake HOA seal, and shoved past the cameras into her car, which had a vanity plate reading Karen for HOA. Lara took a few questions. Calm, factual, precise, no bloating, just justice. Back at home, we celebrated with grilled cheese sandwiches and the satisfaction of knowing the tide had turned. But Lara wasn't done. She immediately began preparing discovery documents for the upcoming trial. The sheriff's office contacted us later that day to say the fraud unit was opening a parallel investigation into Karen's financial records. Apparently, one of the residents Karen had scammed had contacted their nephew, a forensic accountant, and things weren't looking good for the self-appointed president. By nightfall, rumors were already spreading that Karen had built a hidden wine cellar under her deck using HOA funds, stocked with bottles labeled Community Resilience Reserve. Whether that part was true or not didn't matter. What mattered was that the illusion of power she'd built was crumbling, and the woman who once marched around with a clipboard in delusions of authority was now tripping over the very rules she'd invented. And through it all, Lara never stopped moving. She was the storm now, and Karen had just realized she'd built her empire out of paperwork and lies in the middle of a lightning field. The sun rose slowly the next morning, as if even it wasn't quite sure what to make of the chaos unfolding on the mountain, and by the time the mist had cleared, and the pines stopped whispering, we were deep into a discovery process that was turning up more twisted nonsense than either of us expected. Lara was already seated at the dining table, a fortress of folders growing around her like legal armor. Her laptop opened to a spreadsheet color-coded with the intensity of a military operation. I stood in the kitchen watching her fingers fly across the keyboard, logging violation dates, matching receipts, highlighting inconsistencies in Karen's forged HOA letters, and categorizing witness statements from neighbors who once believed they owed fines for things as arbitrary as unauthorized pine cone accumulation and non-regulation curtain visibility. The night before, someone had sent Lara a photo of Karen's garage, which they'd snapped while walking their dog. In it, boxes labeled HOA archives were stacked haphazardly beside cases of wine with fancy faux labels and gold script reading President's Cellar. That might have seemed absurd if it hadn't matched a tip Lara had received from the wine distributor herself, who confirmed that Karen had been placing bulk orders under a business name that didn't legally exist until 2 months ago. According to the records, Karen had spent over $6,000 on luxury wines in less than a year, all billed to Mountain Ridge Preservation LLC. Lara printed the invoices and added them to the rapidly expanding class action binder, which now required a separate tote bag just to move from room to room. Around noon, a knock came at the door. It was the same sheriff's deputy who had visited Karen during the earlier investigation, now with a second officer and a digital recorder clipped to his shoulder. They asked to review our footage, examine the documents, and speak with a few of the residents who joined the lawsuit. Within an hour, the deputy was visibly shaking his head at the sheer volume of absurdity Karen had created. He read through the hand-scrawled citations, laughed once at the hammock permit violation, and then stopped cold when Lara showed him the fake emergency HOA meeting minutes Karen had mailed out with her name typed in all caps beneath the line, Supreme Chairwoman of Community Standards. That was the moment the deputy's entire posture changed. He made a call to the county office, requested someone from Economic Crimes, and asked Lara to prepare a digital copy of every signed complaint she had gathered. By the time he left, he'd assured us that criminal charges were now likely. Lara nodded and returned to her files, not triumphant, but focused. She wasn't celebrating yet. She was getting ready for trial. But Karen, even in the face of collapse, didn't go quietly. That evening, she posted a video on what she called the official Mountain Ridge community channel, filmed shakily by someone holding a phone sideways while Karen stood beneath a banner that read, "Restoring Order Together." In the video, she wore a sash that looked like it had been stolen from a beauty pageant and declared that all actions against her were part of a deeply coordinated smear campaign led by porch squatters and lawless hammock users. She then attempted to read a cease and desist letter aloud, but fumbled halfway through and threw it dramatically behind her, declaring that the real criminals were those who refused to pay dues and were now hiding behind big legal words and city tricks. The video, which was meant to inspire support, instead went semi-viral for the wrong reasons. Someone spliced it with music from courtroom reality shows and uploaded it with the title HOA Karen Declares War on Hammock. Within hours, it was all over local Facebook groups, Reddit threads, and even made its way to a regional news station that had already been tipped off by Lara's live streams. A producer reached out, asking for an interview. Lara declined, stating she wanted the courts to speak first, but the momentum had already shifted into a tidal wave. The next morning, we were awakened by a call from a neighbor near the southern ridge who reported something strange. Karen had been seen digging in her backyard late into the night under the deck, hauling crates and muttering about moving evidence before the legal attack dogs arrived. Lara immediately filed a report and within hours a warrant was issued for property inspection. What they found was almost too ridiculous to believe. Beneath Karen's deck, accessible by a trapdoor hidden under an old rug, was a small room lined with wine racks, fake HOA plaques, laminated bylaws, and boxes of pre-filled violation slips ready to be mailed. The deputy who conducted the search described it as a bunker of bureaucracy, like someone had tried to turn their wine cellar into the headquarters of a delusional empire. Among the discoveries was a binder labeled Master List, which included names, addresses, fake violations, and amounts owed. Some had a red stamp that read Repeat Offender, and included suggestions like double fines or public shaming. One entry listed a neighbor's flower pot color as a visual aggression against the community aesthetic. The final nail came when they discovered a flash drive tucked inside a wine bottle. On it were emails, drafts of bylaws, and even a failed pitch Karen had written for a neighborhood TV show called HOA Watch Mountain Justice. The footage included Karen narrating a tour of the neighborhood while pointing out violations, most of which were imaginary or personal pet peeves. She even referred to Lara as the anarchist of the ridge. When the footage was shown to officials, it erased any remaining doubt about Karen's intentions. This wasn't misguided community service. It was performance art weaponized into fraud. Lara took it all in with the cool precision of someone who had seen worse, who had litigated against larger and more dangerous frauds, but who had never seen such a ridiculous case wrapped in so much ego and glitter. That night, she finalized the final version of the class action filing, included an updated count of affected residents, damages sought, and a formal request that Karen be banned from ever operating or managing any form of civic or residential organization again. The suit now had the support of over 20 neighbors, the attention of the press, and the full cooperation of county investigators. But what struck me most wasn't the legal machinery revving up around us. It was the emotional relief in the voices of our neighbors. People who had been tricked, bullied, and manipulated into thinking they owed something to a woman who had built her authority from the remains of a printer, a clipboard, and a warped desire for control. Some of them cried, others laughed. A few baked pies and showed up at our door with shaky gratitude. One man simply left a note that said, "You saved us from a paper tyrant." The next day, Karen was served with yet another subpoena. This one accompanied by an injunction and a financial freeze on her LLC account. She tried to resist, yelling something about sovereign citizen rights and claiming she would escalate this to federal mountain law. When deputies arrived to enforce the inspection warrant, she fled into the woods behind her cabin in a battered golf cart labeled HOA Enforcement Unit decorated with old campaign stickers and a flag that said "Clean Lawns or Chaos." She was found 2 hours later hiding behind a ranger station. The mountain had gone still, but it was not the quiet of peace. It was the heavy silence before reckoning, the kind of hush that gathers when a storm has passed, but the debris remains and justice has yet to walk through the door. Karen's collapse had begun as a slow unraveling of absurdities. But by the time the sixth subpoena landed in her trembling hands, and her golf cart was towed from public land for lack of registration, the farce had transformed into a legal avalanche with her name carved across every document in bold, irrefutable ink. Lara had spent the week compiling and refining evidence, organizing testimonies, and finalizing motions with the force of someone who had been born in the courtroom, raised by highlighters and cross-references, and now stood again in her natural domain. What had started as a nuisance had become a landmark case, not just for our community, but for every small town where one unhinged neighbor might wake up and decide to build a kingdom out of clipboards and threats. The class action suit was officially green-lit by the court and scheduled for trial within weeks. The charges included fraud, impersonation of a governing body, financial misconduct, emotional distress, and in one bizarre yet legally supported count, attempted governance without consent. Karen's fake HOA was declared null and void by the county. All of her signs were legally removed. Her LLC was frozen. But instead of retreating in shame, Karen doubled down. She posted videos from her cabin window claiming she was under siege by a cartel of anarchist porch sitters. She wrote letters to the local paper accusing Lara of being an agent of chaos who had weaponized the law against true leadership. She even tried to submit her own countersuit against Lara, which the court rejected so swiftly the document was stamped denied before the ink dried. But Karen didn't care about logic or the court. She cared about power, or at least the illusion of it. When 2 local reporters knocked on her door for an interview, she answered in a robe embroidered with "Madam Chairwoman" and insisted on being filmed in front of a plastic podium labeled HOA Crisis Command. When asked if she had any regrets, she said only, "I regret trusting the people to govern themselves." By then, the media had caught on fully. Regional news ran segments titled "Clipboards in Control, the Karen Case," and one network dubbed Lara the HOA Slayer during an evening broadcast that opened with drone footage of our cabin set to dramatic music. Cameras lined the courthouse steps on the day of Karen's formal deposition. Lara arrived early, calm, and prepared. Karen showed up late wearing sunglasses and a sash that read "Community Defender" and spent the first 10 minutes trying to argue with the stenographer about how her name should be recorded. When the judge entered the room, he didn't bother with pleasantries. The evidence was overwhelming. Lara presented signed testimonials, financial ledgers, email chains, and more than a dozen residents who had come forward with horror stories ranging from coerced payments to threats of compliance patrols. Karen tried to counter with a statement written in Sharpie on lined paper, but the judge didn't even look at it. He asked her directly if she had formed an LLC using a fictitious HOA name. She said yes, but only because people need something to believe in. When asked if she collected money under false pretenses, she answered that funding trust requires creative language. When asked if she understood the concept of consent in governance, she scoffed and said, leadership isn't about asking permission. It's about taking initiative. The judge sighed and turned to Lara. "Do you have anything to add?" he asked. Lara replied, "Only that this community never asked for a ruler. We just wanted peace." The ruling was swift and brutal. The court declared Karen's operation fraudulent, ordered full restitution to every person she had solicited or fined, issued a 10-year prohibition on her creating or participating in any organized community group, and placed her cabin under financial lien until damages were paid. Additionally, the court required Karen to publicly post a formal apology in the local paper and community bulletin board for no less than 60 consecutive days. Karen stared at the floor throughout, clutching her clipboard like a life preserver on a sinking ship, but it was over. Her fake empire had collapsed. Her reign of laminated terror was finished. As reporters rushed to document her departure, she shoved past them, shouting, "This isn't the end. You'll see. I'll appeal to higher HOA authorities." When asked what those were, she snapped, "Mountain law is eternal," and drove off in a borrowed station wagon with a duct-taped bumper and a sticker that read, "I break for order." The following weekend, the community held an informal gathering on our land, a potluck celebration filled with laughter, disbelief, and a collective sense of relief. People brought folding chairs, casseroles, and homemade signs that read things like "Hammocks for Freedom" and "HOA Horrible Outlandish Audacity." Lara was quiet for most of the day, sipping tea and smiling politely while neighbors took turns thanking her. Some brought gifts, candles, preserves, even a hand-carved birdhouse labeled "Zone of Legal Sanity." The sheriff stopped by and shook her hand, joking that if she ever ran for mayor, the mountain would back her unanimously. A few days later, a surprise came in the form of a letter from the State Bar Association. They wanted to interview Lara for a profile in their quarterly journal, recognizing her as an exemplary example of ethical law applied in local crisis. She declined the interview, but agreed to submit a short essay about what the experience had taught her. She titled it, "The Law Belongs to Everyone, Even When the Signs Say Otherwise." Meanwhile, Karen had gone silent. Her house sat in eerie stillness, blinds drawn, flags removed. A notice of auction was posted on the tree near her driveway, declaring that in 60 days her property would be sold to repay legal damages. Rumors swirled that she had fled to her sister's place 2 counties over or was hiding out at a lakeside RV park under a new name. But Lara had already filed paperwork preventing her from establishing new entities, and a cease and desist order followed her wherever she tried to file anything vaguely resembling a civic group. One clerk in a neighboring county called us after she tried to register something called the Neighborhood Peace Circle and said, "You wouldn't believe how fast we flagged her application." As things settled and the legal dust finally cleared, we found ourselves returning to the kind of quiet we'd originally sought when we bought this cabin in the first place. Morning coffee on the porch. Bird song drifting through open windows. Wind in the trees not carrying threats or nonsense. Just the natural rhythm of the land. But it wasn't quite the same. The mountain had changed. We had changed. There was a deeper sense of connection between us and the neighbors we once barely knew. We weren't just individuals scattered across acres. We were a community now, forged not by forced bylaws, but by the absurd battle we had survived together. Lara hung a new sign near the base of the trail. A simple piece of cedar wood etched with the words, "No leaders, no fines, just neighbors." There was a strange kind of stillness in the days that followed the final court ruling, not just on the mountain, but inside us, too. Like the air itself had taken a breath it had been holding for far too long, and now had no idea what to do with all the extra oxygen. With Karen gone, or at least legally muzzled and stripped of her fantasy empire, life began to settle into something that resembled peace. But it wasn't the same kind of peace we'd had before she stomped up our trail with a clipboard and delusions of power. It was fuller, heavier in a good way, like the soil after a storm. Messy, but rich with something alive. We got used to seeing neighbors again, not just in passing, but as real people. They stopped by not to drop off complaints or warnings, but muffins and borrowed books and old stories we'd never heard before. Lara would sit on the porch with her folders stacked neatly beside her, not out of necessity anymore, but habit, her brain still half-spooled in litigation mode, scanning the horizon, not for violations, but for calm. Sometimes she'd glance at the mailbox, where a single laminated card now hung that simply read "Welcome." And she'd smirk to herself like she was still waiting for Karen to come walking back up the path in her neon visor, ready for another round. But she never did. Karen had vanished completely from the mountain. Her property was auctioned within weeks, purchased by a young couple from out of town who had no idea they were moving into the most infamous cabin in the region until a neighbor handed them a gift basket and gently warned them never to put up any signs without a sense of irony. They laughed thankfully and decided to embrace the legend, even naming their Wi-Fi network Karen's Ghost. As for Lara, she didn't return to full-time law. Not really. But something in her had reawakened, that sharp spark that made her thrive in the middle of complexity and conflict. And soon she found herself helping other small communities across the state understand their rights. It started with a single Zoom call to a woman dealing with a similar problem in another rural county. And before long, she was quietly known online as the HOA Whisperer. The one who could dismantle phony associations and predatory governance with nothing more than a calm voice and a folder of real facts. She never charged a dime. She just did it because she knew what it felt like to be targeted, tricked, and told to fall in line when there wasn't even a line to begin with. It became her quiet form of service, and watching her work was like seeing someone return to their natural element. Not the courtroom exactly, but something deeper. A space where her skills met justice without bureaucracy getting in the way. People trusted her, not just because she was smart, but because she never made them feel stupid for getting caught in someone else's fake system. She reminded them that being scammed didn't make them weak. It just meant someone else had lied louder and she helped them find their voice again. The story of Karen didn't die out. Not exactly. It transformed. Local news aired a short documentary titled The Clipboard Queen. And while they offered Lara a segment, she declined to appear on camera, choosing instead to submit a written statement that emphasized the role of community, the importance of knowing your rights, and the quiet courage it takes to stand up when someone demands authority they never earned. The documentary became unexpectedly popular, not just because of the drama, but because it was funny in that tragic, ridiculous way small-town legends always are. People couldn't believe that one woman with a printer and a highlighter could cause such chaos. But the more they watched, the more they recognized a version of Karen in someone they knew, a nosy neighbor, a petty landlord, an overzealous committee chair. It struck a chord. Memes followed. T-shirts, too. Someone printed mugs that read, "You're violating the vibe." And for a brief bizarre moment, our little mountain found itself at the center of an internet cultural ripple. We didn't mind. As long as no one showed up trying to revive the HOA, they could laugh all they wanted.